going to turn another kind of significant page here. I know I these are all arbitrary, but I we first started out with the classical kind of period, and I have a very loose definition of classical. I think of classical as being any society that thinks that they have an idea of what their relationship to the universe is, and that could be Native Americans, but usually we associate it with the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle. And then we went through the period of Christianity, uh, which lasted over 1,000 years and controlled and dominated the intellectual climate. Not much happened outside of the purview of Christianity during that period of time. So for philosophy, the kind of uninteresting part of that is it's not interesting to me when you know what the answer has to be before you start figuring out the problem. But that's the way Christianity works. You can't come up with an answer that contradicts scripture. But now we're just coming out of it with the Enlightenment, and people have different ways of saying or different signposts for the Enlightenment. Some people will start with Descartes and Hobbes. Uh, I usually start with, I think of it as starting with Hume and Kant for us. And then today we're going to go into, well, German idealism and Romanticism on the one hand, and still Enlightenment on the other. Um, but the Romantics, the Enlightenment can be said to last to about 1800, and the Romantics kind of followed that. Wordsworth was, around beginning of the 19th century, 1800s. Same with Byron, same with Keats. Um, but we won't talk too much about them, but I do want to talk a little bit about Goethe, and I think of him as a romantic. And basically, a lot of the 19th century is romanticism. And what I mean by that is there's an emphasis on passion and feelings over analytic thinking. You're kind of looking for the grand vision. In fact, it's what people usually look for when they study philosophy or begin to study philosophy. They're looking for the big picture, the big moment, the big truth. And we get a lot of that in the 19th century with German idealism, with Hegel, and then we'll be going on from that to Marx. I kind of think of Marx as a romantic, oddly enough, but I'll explain that later. And then of course, we have the existentialists and all that. That's a really a lot of stuff to happen in one century, but I guess no more than the fifth century BC of Greece. Um, so the uh, excuse me. So they're looking for grand and dramatic visions rather than careful analysis. I think that's fair. And I want to, before we get started on Hegel, I want to record a couple of responses to it. Now, I don't know if any of you have a source for the quote, but Steve Erickson in Pomona College said something like, "You can never be fully human unless you become a romantic, but you also can't progress in your humanity if you remain a romantic." And so that kind of dynamic is what we're going to examine here. Uh, Here's a couple of quotes one from C.S. Lewis on that same theme. He says, "The books or music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust them, for they are not the thing itself." Another one I really like from Anais Nin, is a pretty interesting person. I'm not that much of a knowledgeable person about her. My second wife was loved an Anais Nin. But anyway, this is her talking. What makes people despair is that they try to find a universal meaning to the whole of life and then end up by saying it's absurd, illogical, and empty of meaning. There is not one big cosmic meaning for it all. There is only the meaning which we each give to our life, an individual meaning, an individual plot, like an individual novel, a book for each person. To seek a total unity is wrong. To give as much meaning to one's life as possible seems right to me. For example, I'm not committed to any of the political movements, which I find full of fanaticism and injustice. But in the face of each human being, I act democratically and humanly. All right, so uh, I I sympathize with Anais on that score, and she's echoing a lot of the themes we're going to see in the 19th century, particularly, I think, in her case with Nietzsche and Sartre. Uh, but anyway, I think of a lot of these things as narratives. I didn't include Freud in that list, but Freud is more of a scientist. I think Freud and Marx and Hobbes, oddly enough, all thought of themselves as being empirical scientists. Uh, Not so oddly, I don't think, in the case of Freud, but I think in the case of Marx and Hobbes, it was a big mistake. They, I don't think they were who they thought they were. Let's put it that way. Now, I want to talk about Goethe a little bit because Goethe is kind of contemporary with, I would say, let's see, do I have his dates here? Uh, Maybe not. Anyway, Goethe's kind
Um,
of,
1749 to 1832.
geez, how do you remember this stuff,
I don't
Peter?
know. I'm good at remembering dates. I forget all sorts of things.
Well, yeah, okay. Anyway, I was thinking early 19th century is his when he flourished, and um, of course he wrote Faust, and Faust was here's something kind of funny. Faust was based on an actual guy named Faust. The Faust myth, by the way, is the Faust myth is that it's like Robert Johnson. You go down the crossroads and you make a deal with the devil. That's the Faust myth. I'm not going to, the actual book Faust by, or poem by Goethe is much more complicated than that. But that's the idea. Faust has reached middle age, everything is meaningless, and he makes a deal with the devil to give him a life full of passion. And the deal is okay, I'm going to give you that, but once you say, I'm fine, I'm happy now, I'm going to take your soul. And the actual quote from Goethe is when you reach a moment where you say, abide moment, thou art so fair, the devil will take your soul. And the theme throughout the 19th century is going to be change and striving and progress both spiritually and in the case of the real world, technologically. And uh, Hegel is the guy that's going to emphasize that. Now, before I start on Hegel, though, Schopenhauer is another guy in kind of this era following Hegel. And Hegel gave birth to a lot of guys. Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, all of those guys were heavily influenced by Hegel. His dates, Peter, are 1770 to 1831, more or less the same period as Goethe. And it seemed like to me there was something in the zeitgeist that it wasn't just Germany. It was also England. This kind of attitude about striving and change and so forth. I didn't mention, with regard to zeitgeists, as an aside, there was also, I think, a zeitgeist around the time of the American Revolution, because we mentioned Kant's categorical imperative that you should all well, one version of it is all men should be considered as ends and not as means. And that is pretty contemporaneous with uh, Jefferson saying all men are created equal. And those are new ideas, by the way. The Greeks didn't believe that. The Christians didn't believe that. People did not believe that all, I mean, Jesus has this all men are brothers thing. Even that isn't a direct quote from him. But uh, the idea that all people are equal is a new idea with Kant and Jefferson. It's not the common done thing to think that all people are equal. And it may be, well, we'll get into that later. Anyway, a lot of the responses to Hegel were not positive. And my favorite one is by Schopenhauer. And this is a quote from Schopenhauer. It, meaning his philosophy, is a colossal piece of mystification which will yet provide posterity with an inexhaustible theme for laughter at our times. A pseudo philosophy paralyzing all mental powers, stifling all real thinking, and by the most outrageous misuse of language, putting in its place the hollowest, most senseless, thoughtless, and, as is confirmed by its success, most stupefying verbiage. The height of audacity in serving up pure nonsense, in stringing together senseless and extravagant mazes of words, such as had been only previously known in madhouses. It was finally reached in Hegel and became the instrument of the most barefaced general mystification that has ever taken place, with a result which will appear fabulous to posterity as a moment of German stupidity. Now, you got to love that. I mean, uh, I like to criticize these guys, but I'm a little more restrained than that. But if you, I will say that if you try to read Hegel, which I don't really recommend, Hegel and Kant, the worst guys to read are Hegel, Kant, and Heidegger. I would say Sartre's no walk in the park either, but those are the worst, and some parts of Marx. And they're just so full of basically, Schopenhauer's not wrong. They are full of mystifying sentences that are just, a bunch of gobbledygook and weird phrases and weird terminology that it doesn't lend itself to transparency. Let's put it that way. So, the phenomenology of spirit is his great work, and Hegel is famous for the dialectic. He's the guy prior to Marx that he's the guy that Marx gets the dialectic from. So, what is a dialectic? It's not. Remember, we use that word with Plato. The dialectic is the conversation that people have trying to figure out how the world works. That's not what uh, Hegel is about. He's saying that uh, the there is a kind of dynamic to the intellectual development of the spirit, and he's going to call it absolute spirit, is what we're after. And here's what he says, and this is from his Logic, a much misunderstood phenomenon in the history of philosophy, and this pertains to how we've been perceiving. Much misunderstood phenomenon in the history of philosophy, a refutation of one system by another, of an earlier by a later. Most commonly, the refutation is taken in a purely negative sense to mean that the system refuted has ceased to account for anything, has been set aside and done for. Were it so, the history of philosophy would be of all studies the most saddening, displaying as it does the refutation of every system which time has brought forth. Um, but what he says is the refutation of a philosophy only means that its barriers are crossed and its special principle reduced to a factor in the completer principle that follows. Hegel is going to emphasize growth, and I think he takes this from. Do you remember Aristotle saying that the unique thing about the human mind is the will to understand. And Hegel takes this to a new, different level because I think I mentioned this last week. Kant has severed the mind from being just the idea of the mind from being just a passive recipient of information that we then analyze. The reality is out there, and the more we study it, the closer we'll get to what it really is. But Kant says this is limited to the things that are presented to us by the perceptions. In other words, the phenomenal world, what he calls the phenomenal world. But Hegel says, okay, if you're going to say that the mind has a creative um, force or creative function in understanding the world, then the mind can be perceived as not a static thing, but something that changes and something that can grow. And he thinks that the human spirit, what Aristotle was referring to, applies to what he calls a dialectic process. And so when he's talking about, like, been going through these guys and refuting some of them, not all of them, and he considers that not a done deal when you refute them. Now, and he's a big opposites guy, so you could compare him to Heraclitus, the guy who thought that it was a combination of negatives or opposites that made up reality, or yin and yang. Uh, these these concepts are part of Hegel's thinking, but he's going to vastly elaborate on them. And he's also always presented as having a theory of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Those are terms he never uses himself. But I'm going to try to give you kind of some little homey examples of what he's on about. I think these are fair, even though they're much more pedestrian than his language that he uses. Uh, so I'll start with an example of a baseball player. You could use it for anything like ski, any sport you're learning. But when you learn the sport, let's say you're a natural athlete and you're pretty good at hitting the ball, and then you get to the major leagues, and all of a sudden you're presented with a very top flight curveball, and you're just at a loss. You can't hit the curveball. If that's true, you're going to have to return to the minors and never see the big leagues again. You've got to learn how to hit it. So, what in Hegel's mind you've reached is a limit of your mastery, and this is he thinks of this as mostly an intellectual thing. But I'm using the baseball analogy. So you've hit a limit to your abilities and understanding. And you have two choices. And this would go back to, or this would lend itself to Bob Dylan's He Not Busy Being Born is Busy Dying. Uh, Hegel says you have two options there. You can quit or you can reevaluate and rebuild yourself. Hegel also likes the use of the analogy of growth, organic growth of a plant. A plant could be growing and in one direction all of a sudden hits a wall. Now, it could just stop growing in that direction. But another option would be to rethink its structure from the get-go. And what it's going to have to do is uh, send a message to the its fundamental structure, and send the message that we have to restructure the plant and send out a new branch in a new direction. So Hegel also likes this analogy to what you're doing. But going back to the baseball player, so what happens is you can't hit a curveball. So then your coach takes you and he shows you video of your stance, and he shows you a bunch of video of you missing the ball. And what Hegel says at this point is that you become alienated from yourself. You're looking at yourself as an object. You're looking at yourself as what Hegel says is the other. You're looking at yourself as an object, and you're analyzing from the outside uh, what you're doing and who you are. And this is, he calls this alienation, which Marx is going to use in a different context, but he gets it from Hegel. You're alienated from yourself. You're looking for yourself and judging from yourself as an outsider. And from that analysis, you realize that, and your coach helps you say, you realize that what you have to do is uh, maybe change your stance a little bit or wait a little longer, learn how to wait on a pitch. Whatever you athletes here would know better than I, but whatever the coach tells you, it's not natural to you. You're going to have to reject your former comfort. And what will happen then is you'll go through a stage of what Hegel calls mediation. You're going to be awkward. When you're trying this new thing, you were so comfortable with your old swing and your old stance that changing it, and I've read Tiger Woods talked about this, changing his swing. He's already a successful golfer. And then his coach says, well, we want you to change your swing. Well, he's going to go through a period where he's not happy with how he's playing. And this is a period of negation or mediation, according to the terminology of Hegel. And then there is a reuniting. Once you get comfortable with the new stance and the new swing, uh, you will start to feel yourself again. You'll become reunited, and you haven't really left the other self behind. It's still there, but you're going to now become a whole, but on a new level. That's the idea. That's a metaphor for what Hegel talks about. Another one I like to use is I used to go I used to go hiking in Point Reyes, and I would say, oh yeah, that's a tree, that's a rock, that's some dirt, there's a bird, and that's all I knew about it. And then I took classes in ornithology and biology and geology at the College of Marin, and I learned to identify the things that uh, had previously just been general names to me. Now, during that period, I would be confused because I hadn't fully learned those things. They, I'd go, okay, that was a red crossbill or what, in other words, I would go through a period of confusion where I hadn't really digested all the new things I'd learned, and now I was almost more confused than I was before because at least I knew something was a rock. I didn't know it was nice or sedimentary rock or anything like that. I just knew it was a rock and that was satisfactory. But now I'm confused. I look at the rock and I don't know what the hell it is. And then after a while, all these things become familiar. And what Hegel's point is going to be, and this is going to be picked up also by Heidegger, is that not only has your ability changed, but the world you perceive has changed. So the subject and the object have both evolved, as it were. They've both gone through this process because, as Bishop Berkeley said, to be is to be perceived. And so the fact that the world I was experiencing, which was the only world I could experience, was a world of vagueness about rocks and trees and birds. And now I'm experiencing a different world. So it's not just that I've changed, the world itself has changed. The classical view is that the world is out there and that it is kind of a eternal or stable thing that I just have to comport myself. I have to learn how to understand. But after Hegel, the idea is more that our knowledge which is subjective, advances, but so does the object because it doesn't exist any place. And this is goes back to Aristotle. Our understanding of the world doesn't exist any place except in our consciousness. There's no in the Middle Ages, the monks would like to say God understands what things really are. But if you're not going to abide by that, you have to believe that we are the things. We humans are the source of understanding. We are the nexus of understanding. And so Hegel envisages that uh, this dynamic, which is, like I say, often described thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The just to go back to the baseball player, the thesis is he was a natural player. The antithesis is where he becomes an awkward and unnatural player, and then the synthesis is where now he's come back together with himself and become whole, but on a new level. So Hegel thinks that this dynamic occurs not just in the individual, but it also occurs uh, at for the human race as a whole. And so you can describe historical developments in the same using the same dynamic. And what you could say is, so the United States in the 40s uh, had to become a different nation in order to defend itself or defend its allies from Germany and Japan. It had to transform itself into an industrial military power that it didn't have before. So it was challenged by something. It was, well, let's just forget the depression for a second, but it was just doing fine, just kind of a agricultural uh, backwater, isolationist. And then it got involved in the Second World War, and that was a challenge to its existence. It had to transform itself. So there was a period where it had to rebuild and rethink what it was. And then it came back together at the victories in Europe and Japan. And then there was a period in the 50s where it was comfortable with itself. Uh, for a variety of reasons. One was it was the biggest economic power on the planet because the rest of the industrial world had been destroyed by bombing, and it had been uh, because it's mercifully separated from Europe and Japan by huge numbers of miles of ocean. It was protected from being bombed, but they weren't, and so they were devastated. And now we had a very large degree of confidence, both economically and philosophically, in our superiority, and we were solid in that until the 60s came along and a bunch of hippies with long hair said, "No, screw that. We don't like your values. We don't like the racism. We don't like the domination of mercantilism or whatever we thought. We want a more spiritual world." So then the society was torn apart once again. This is all kind of a Hegelian look at it. And then it came back together to the extent that you could buy granola at Safeway. And the society wasn't so separated. Now, right now, we might be going through another period of alienation where the society has torn itself apart. And it remains to be seen in all stages, it remains to be seen whether the result is a positive one, because you could be killed by this alienation. And Hegel will say that your ability to endure the alienation or that period of time, like the baseball player where he can't hit a ball at all now, your ability to endure that uh, is a signal of your ability to grow spiritually. If you cave in, if you say, no, I can't do it, well, then he not busy being born is busy dying. And so this kind of metaphor of growth, organic growth, and this dynamic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is a way to understand yourself and to understand history. Uh, there are a lot of what we're going to be talking about now is narratives, various ways to understand how history worked. And I'm like Hegel. I think that you don't refute them. You see how they could challenge your opinion or your self-image or your goals or aspirations. That's what you see that there may be a negation that you're going to have to face there. You can look at that in your own life, and I can, and see various times when I chose various things. And you can say, well, that's just novelizing your life. You're just kind of making a story about it, but that's what we do anyway. And this is one way to understand the structure of the choices you've made in your life. I certainly do that myself. And as a matter of fact, these guys, from Hegel through to Kierkegaard, these guys are at the heart of my understanding of philosophy from the beginning. And they're kind of things that I have completely absorbed into my own understanding of the world. However, I refer you back to the Anais Nin quote that I don't think it's sufficient to find yourself happy with the narrative you've written for yourself. I think you have to, and this is from Nietzsche, the things that you're most sure about are the things you have to uh, challenge with all of your spirit. And so with Hegel and Nietzsche, the depth to which you can question yourself and challenge yourself and negate your former self is the gauge by which you will grow and become spiritually more aware and more free. Freedom is one of the things that Hegel talks about as achieving. And uh, what we're all ending searching for is, in the end, what he calls absolute spirit. This would be similar to Doug is familiar with Teilhard de Chardin, the omega point. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of parallel in Hegel's thinking to the omega point of Teilhard de Chardin. Uh, that, in a nutshell, is the structure of Hegel and the terms that he uses, like negation, mediation, and uh, reunification, alienation. These terms are his way of describing the dynamic that I just used very humble examples for. Uh, another in history, another way of interpreting history that we've seen aside from America is in China. People have taken Marx to heart. Now, Marx inherits the dialectic from Hegel, but certainly this is what Mao did in China when in the Cultural Revolution. I don't know whether you have studied anything about that or not, but Mao was a diehard Marxist, and he thought that the intellectuals should have to go out and work on the farms, and the farm workers should become intellectuals because of the dialectic. He thought whatever their main thing was, needed to be challenged, and so the Red Guards became free to go out and kill all the intellectuals, and it was a nasty business. And then some intellectuals became farm workers. But the idea was this was going to build a classless society eventually from this Sturm und Drang. It was a nasty kind of business. Okay. That's mainly what I have to say about Hegel. Douglas has his hand up in the chat, so let me see what he has to say. Yeah, Goethe also wrote Light and Color. Uh, And before studying Zen. Yeah. Um, okay. So those are our, that's the basic, uh, you know, in a nutshell, theory of Hegel. I think you can look at your own life, if maybe not, but I bet you can look at your own life and reinterpret it through the negation, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis dynamic. You can look back at things you've done that reversed who you were. Maybe not, but I certainly can. Meredith's shaking her head, nodding her head. I can't hear you.
I'm agreeing with Jeff's suggestion that I listen to all of this
Oh,
that I've missed.
oh,
Sorry.
I see. I thought you were nodding because I had said something so brilliant. Um,
I'm sure you did.
uh, Alan, are you just arriving?
Yes, just arriving.
Okay. Well, you have to be assigned study hall to go back and uh, uh, listen to the first bit of this. Because Hegel is kind of a threshold, I think, into before this, we didn't have time wasn't involved in knowledge before this, even with Kant. The progress of time was not something thought of by the previous philosophers. Certainly not Plato, Aristotle, certainly not the Christians. Uh, but Hegel brings this idea of a dynamic consciousness that is changing and morphing as it goes through time. Deborah.
I mean, at first, when I was listening to you, I thought this sounds a lot like Darwin, who came along a few years later. But Darwin didn't like Hegel, right? I mean, Darwin kind of refuted Hegel, and to me, it kind of sounds like evolution.
Well, the difference there's a profound difference, and that is evolution doesn't have any direction or desire to be anything greater than it is. Evolution is always reactionary. It doesn't have a concept of a higher, a more elevated consciousness or spirit than it has.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's a pretty big difference. It's really almost impossible to get it in your mind how mindless evolution is, how spiritless and directionless it is. It's very alien, the process of evolution, especially because we like to think of ourselves as the peak of evolution.
Mm.
Obviously, it was going to head for us, so we could listen to you know, Wild Thing by the Trogs.
Ooh, what? So, there's a point at which, there's a stasis. You're right. So, does he have a sense of how do you get on, like what I call getting unstuck? Um, where you get to that stage where there's no antithesis, right, to cause you to go forward or to change or it seems to me that you can easily become happy where you are. Is there propulsion? How does he address that question, or just assume that there is a process and you either follow or you don't?
That is, I I'm not sure exactly where that is addressed in Hegel, but he assumes everybody has this spirit and they want to grow. And if you're going to want to grow, you're going to experience a negativity. You're going to experience a wall or a threshold, a hurdle beyond which you can progress or you can choose to turn back. That's his dynamic. But what propels you, I think I'm just going to say it goes back to he understood Aristotle, of course. I'm going to assume it goes back to Aristotle's idea that all human beings desire to understand. And that understanding is going to take you to, if you pursue it sincerely, is going to take you to places where you don't understand. And then you either recognize that and stay in your own rut. There is a parallel in what's called punctuated equilibrium in evolution, which was advanced by Stephen Jay Gould, and that is the idea that yeah, there are critters that have been around for millions of years without changing hardly at all. And then we find that some critters can change within 1,000 years. They can be completely different. And so that was the idea Darwin had was that everything happened at a snail's pace. And then Gould came along and advocated a uh, modification of that, whereas many animals just evolve very little over a long period of time. Some animals can evolve very rapidly depending on the threats they have. And so, uh, if you like evolution, if you are pursuing things and comfortable in your pursuit, you're not going to find yourself running up any against any negativity. But that's why Nietzsche says that you have to take the step and challenge everything that you believe. And the more passionately you believe it, the more important it is to challenge it. That's not what a Christian would say. Okay, Mr. Barry.
Yeah, I mean, this whole Hegelian logic really seems to me so pertinent to what we're going through politically right now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's and one thing that seems curious to me is that the MAGA reaction to, let's say, wokeism or to the liberal consensus um, is obvious. You know, it's an obvious antithesis kind of reaction. But it's interesting that it also brings back with it Christianity. It's bringing Christianity back into the forefront. So I just thought that was it's kind of interesting because I mean to me it's sort of like well all of this liberal wokeism stuff and diversity and everything that you guys have been pushing is just not right, and we want to go back to something more easily understood or more comfortable in a way, and so they bring with it the Christian way of thinking.
I don't think that's true. They aren't anything like the Christian way of thinking. They use the name, they've just hijacked the brand and used the term Christian. What they mean is, well, I don't want to mischaracterize them, but my impression is what they mean is uh, white male dominated society.
Yeah,
They're
but I do think they find comfort in that. I mean, again,
Yeah, why
yeah,
not? They're
yeah,
white and they're male. So,
yeah, yeah.
but I don't want to go too far into the politics of today. But anyway, I think looking at it through Hegelian prism or Hegelian framework is perhaps positive because Hegel sees challenges to the way you think as being perhaps the road of progress. And bear in mind that there's a threat every time you go through one of these mediations or negations of yourself. There is a threat to your existence, and if you can't handle the threat, then you're not going to change. And he considers the change a positive thing. So the idea that you're going to arrive at a certain, that's why I quoted Goethe at the beginning of this. The idea that when you reach a point where it's abide moment thou art so fair and you don't want to ever change again, the devil will take your soul. That is that theme is written out in philosophical terms by Hegel. Peter, can't hear you.
Trying to unmute.
Okay.
There
There we
we
go.
go.
Uh,
Gotcha.
I think there's a lot in the thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea, and I like the way you've expounded it. But I've been reading Carl Friedrich's introduction to the philosophy of Nietzsche in the Modern Library, which I find intelligible. Trying to read Hegel, the philosophy of Hegel, sorry. Trying to read Hegel, I can't really make sense out of what he says. He's about the only major philosopher that I really can't understand him sentence by sentence. But one thing Friedrich says at the very beginning is the philosophy of Hegel has always seemed to me fundamentally wrong. But he says, since he's writing in about 1953, it's had so much influence on so much modern philosophy. And he mentions communism, obviously, including Marx, fascism, pragmatism, and existentialism. You really have to study Hegel if you want to understand anything that came after him. Um, and he doesn't immediately say what it is he doesn't like about Hegel. But in his little preface, he says what bothers him, and I think it bothers me as one aspect of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea, is that it becomes a success philosophy. That is, whatever succeeds is what the absolute spirit is expressing itself as and what it really wants to be. And of course, the notorious contemporary example is that the Prussian state to Hegel represents the divine idea as it exists in his time. But the trouble with this success philosophy, and he says it is there in fascism, it's there in Marxism, it's there in pragmatism, not necessarily in existentialism, though, is that whatever happens, whatever succeeds, is ratified by history and absolute spirit. And Friedrich says there's no appreciation for the poignant value of the lost cause. And of course, he's not referring to the Confederacy there. He's just saying that causes are lost, and yet they had value. And the trouble with Hegel's attitude is that everything that is taken up into the new synthesis is okay, and everything that isn't is supposed to be lost. So Friedrich objects to that the victory of one cause or another, or one idea or another, does not necessarily prove that it's in any sense true, or the embodiment of absolute spirit. I put it clumsily because, as I said, I can't read Hegel, but that seems like a legitimate criticism.
There's
And you know that,
go ahead.
well, the kind of every day and every way I'm getting better and better philosophy, which I don't suppose Hegel would have liked. Nietzsche hated it pretty much. Um, can become a kind of complacency. I'm growing, so now must be better than before. I mean, what it goes back to is the idea of progress, that Hegel may have taken progress too seriously, or believed in it too much.
I would say one of the problems with Hegel is not so much any theory, it's that it's such a massive system that it's got to have stuff wrong with it, and you can pick any theory and take it apart as we've been doing throughout this semester. But Hegel himself, I don't think, says that we do leave those things behind. Like we can pick up right now, I can pick up Plato and criticize something that's modern. So I
Mhm.
don't think we necessarily leave the past, even though it is not trendy now, we necessarily leave it behind. On the other hand, this is um, the hopefulness of it is consistent with Alan can help me out here. The quote, "The arc of justice is long, or the arc of something,
Yeah.
history is long, but it bends towards justice,
The
something like
moral
that.
arc of the
Right.
universe is long,
Moral
but
arc of the
it's toward
universe.
justice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in a way, I think Hegel is hopeful in that way, in that the it it's long and there are going to be a lot of but oh, another
Yeah.
thing I think is different though is Hegel doesn't think that of absolute spirit as something that's out there. It's something that it's a creative process. So that as I said, the object, which is the world that we perceive, is evolving, and at the same time, our consciousness is evolving. And if you take it on a societal level, the things that we wish to achieve as a society evolve as the society evolves. So we can't. What the Christians did was just kind of stop for 1,000 years, but we expect things to change, and we expect things now to not um, cease evolving,
Yeah.
uh, which is something that wasn't expected 1,000 years ago.
I think, to me, when I'm looking at contemporary politics a little bit through this lens, and it seems to me you end up with this kind of pendulum effect where any set of beliefs is not completely true or completely,
Mhm.
fulfilling, and so that gives rise to the counterpoint, which moves you to a new place, but that new place inherently is not completely satisfactory either, and it has the seeds of its own antithesis, and so you keep moving back and forth. So this raises the question that Peter's talking about is, are you actually making progress, or are you just moving back and forth between political ideas because any one set of them is not sufficient to achieve a stasis?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to look at the history of America and not see progress. We don't have slaves anymore. Women can vote. Uh, it may not be very dramatic, but those things were all hard-fought battles. The Civil War over slavery and certainly women's suffrage, that took a long time and was a seriously fought battle. And yet we've come out on the hopeful side of it. But with every change, there's no guarantee that you're going to come out on a good side. That is what we're going through right now. I don't think there's any guarantee that the end result of all this stuff we're going through right now is going to be positive. Peter.
Me,
Oh,
Um,
can I say something?
yes,
Go
please.
ahead.
Um, I don't want to accept the notion that MAGA has captured Christianity.
No, they
Um,
haven't. They've hijacked the brand. They haven't captured Christianity.
well, I think that many people, when they see the way that some Christians have determined that the church is an arm of the conservative movement, and that I've read several articles about ministers who've been criticized by their parishioners for not being conservative enough, and that they should be preaching sermons that support the notions of MAGA. So that disturbs me because I don't think that's fair to Christianity.
There's a uh, Christianity is a big tent. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that there are guys on the front lines right now preaching in evangelical churches that know the Bible and know that MAGA is wrong. And they are trying to gently persuade their congregations that this is not a good path. I'm not saying they all are, but I'm sure I am sure there are pastors in the evangelical world that know what's going on and see it. And well, I mean, we know that there are because they published articles, but they're on the front lines, those guys. And some of them are probably fully MAGA themselves, but I bet a lot of them are trying to gently persuade their, that's what pastors do. They don't say, "Hey, I'm quitting. You guys are assholes." They if they have a strong faith in the Bible, they're willing to put themselves on the line to try to make people see righteousness as they see it and as they think the Bible sees it. Peter?
Yeah, 2 points. One, in answer to what Meredith said, I think Trump's movement, though it doesn't advertise itself this way, is a particularly crude form of what's called Erastianism. That is basically the state controls everything, including religion, and whatever the state determines religion is what religion is. And I certainly hope it doesn't work. Hobbes is considered an Erastian because he didn't want church to have any Erastian, Thomas Erastus, not Desiderius Erasmus. That's the idea that the state should basically determine, what a church is able to teach, what a church is able to do, and so on. And I hope in the long run there's a conflict there because there are many Christians who do not see it that way. But the other thing, what you said about progress and the moral arc of the universe, reminds me of this two-line Walt Whitman poem called Roaming in Thought after reading Hegel.
Really?
Roaming in thought over the universe, I saw the little that is good slowly hastening towards immortality, and the vast all that is called evil, I saw hastening to merge itself and become lost and dead. That's very beautiful. I'm just not sure it's true.
Well,
That's
none of us are true. How can we be sure that's true?
Yeah, but Whitman was sure, and he loved Hegel's optimism and, gave it his own American slant. No, we can't be sure. And we can't be sure that the moral arc of the universe bends toward anything. So that when Martin Luther King Jr. says it, that's a very serious statement of faith. But some people will quote it as if it were, I'm not talking about you, but quote it as if it were an empirical observation. But empirical observation can't take you to that point, or to the point Whitman's talking about. If you don't have faith in it, you just don't have faith in it.
Right. So the teachings of Hegel are just a way of a framework, and that's what Marx is, and that's what Freud is. They're a framework. Plato, same thing. A framework that you can conceive of what society is using that, or you can, as Plato did, you can also direct it towards your own life. You can have the three parts of society with Plato, or the three parts of the soul. And with Hegel, you can see society going through uh, a dialectic, and you can also see yourself going through a dialectic. So these are narratives or structures or frameworks to just to understand your life. I don't see that we have to, and maybe it was you, Peter, that suggested we have to toss one out. I think they all can inform us, and that's how we will continue to operate here. I think I said at one point what you do in philosophy is you go through all of what we're doing, and then you start over again, and then you look at, say, you look at Plato through a Hegelian framework, or you look at the Christians through a Marxist framework, all of which is possible.
I buy that.
Yeah, and I find that illuminating, and some people would just say it's too frustrating and it's just a waste of time. But I that isn't how it appeals to me to do it. And the reason it appeals to me actually is that fear, the kids have this FOMO, fear of missing out. What if there's something, what if I accept some kind of, and this comes from Nietzsche too. What if I accept some kind of teaching, but I hadn't considered uh, this thing that if you look at it from this perspective, it might not be so right. I don't want to miss out on that point that I might have missed. One guy, I can't remember who it was, defines philosophy as just a series of remindings. You just remind yourself, have you thought about this? And so that's what these all these different frameworks. We don't have to put any of them to bed, I don't think.
Yeah,
These,
I think just, I think in the political realm, again, I think each time I'll use the pendulum analogy, each time the pendulum swings, it usually swings too far in a direction. And I think, when I'm thinking about some of the people of the liberal side of American politics who were very concerned about wokeism early on and felt like it was a dangerous place kind of to go, and it was giving the right a very strong weapon to use against it. And it seems like, any dominant, once a series of ideas becomes dominant, it tends to believe it's self-righteously right about everything and press too far in a direction, somewhat because it's still reacting against the thing that it gave birth to it, which was the thing that it is reacting against. So I think Hegel gives a good warning to not get complacent, that just because you've successfully defeated the opposing set of ideas, that you can just ride into the sunset with your set of ideas without questioning them.
yeah, I think that was well said. Uh, all right. Well, the next thing we're going to take a look at is Marx. Let's see, we learned from history that we never learned from history, attributed to Hegel. That's kind of similar to the Santayana quote, but I always say that nobody ever understands history anyway. You always look at history through some lens that pleases you, just like Herodotus did, the first historian. That's what he did, and that's what we always do: is learn some lesson that we already agree with, and find historical examples that support our theory of history. I find history. I mean, what happened in the United States in the last 2 days? Could you explain it and be absolutely sure that you were right? No. So, what happened in the 17th century, in the entire 17th century? Do you have confidence that you can describe that with empirical validity? I don't. So anyway, all historians tell stories. In fact, I think who's an historian? Is anybody a historian here? Uh, I think the modern trend in history is to be very, you know, positivist. In other words, you try to get the facts verified, and you try not to import any kind of uh, ideological interpretation on what happened. That makes it very boring to read, but I think that's the scholarly way to approach. I could be wrong. I have a retired history professor who's an old friend. I should ask you about it. Uh, Doug is okay. Good luck with what, Doug? He says good luck with something. You should just speak
That
up.
positivist history thing, not having any
Well,
slant to it.
the idea is that you're trying to just establish the facts, and other people can interpret what's going on. Uh, right, but yeah, what you're saying is maybe that's not possible.
Everybody's always got a lens.
Peter,
Yeah, I think the positivist view is under criticism a lot from both the left and the right, or anywhere else you can think of. That is, people have become aware that absolutely neutral social science or absolutely neutral history isn't really possible because you always have some kind of purpose. And I think that criticism is sometimes carried too far, as in Deborah Baker's book on Charlottesville, where she begins by quoting Frederick Douglass, whom I greatly respect, but the quotation is pretty much studying the past is only of importance as far as it can be used in the present, which I think is, almost as restrictive a view of history as the positivist, just the facts, ma'am view.
well,
It's, you got to care about what the past really was.
we can, Nietzsche, who we'll get to soon, says that it's just on the face of it. I don't think he says on the face of it, but on the face of it, I find this true that it's clear that our understanding of nature, the universe, and history are very finite compared to what the facts are. There's no way we will ever understand history or ever understand the universe. You just kind of have to pick one that works for you. And that's kind of depressing because you want to know what the absolute truth is. Everybody does. And that's why the historians that are trying to be objective with the positivism, uh, they're trying to at least get a fundamental empirical
Mhm.
playing field
Sure.
to go from, and then interpret from that. But Nietzsche's going to say that any understanding is at the same time putting blinders on for any other understanding.
I'd like to bring up the idea of low inference versus high inference and how that applies to the interpretation of history. So, for example, we have a recording of this class, and so we could come up with a transcript of each word that each person said. And if we could agree upon that, that would be a very low inference description of the class. In other words, the things that we could universally agree upon were words that were spoken. But then when we begin to generalize about the class and say that Alan was late and he's often late, therefore he's an absent-minded kind of guy, or that that Otis was present but didn't say anything and didn't seem to be looking at the camera much of the time. He was sort of bored by the class. I mean, as soon as you begin to
Interpret.
put some value or interpretation to it, you've moved to a higher inference. And I think in the study of history, there are you begin with facts. What actually happened? How many was this battle fought? How many people were killed? Who won? You can kind of come upon the things that people will agree about because they're supported by a certain kind of evidence that doesn't seem controversial. But then when you move past that, you're getting into higher inference interpretation, which we seem to be agreeing is more interesting, but also um, less. People are clearly going to disagree about it, coming from their own perspective and values and alliances. Um, so I think, when I teach students about doing qualitative research, and we will all observe a classroom session of a fourth grade teacher teaching math or something, and then talk about um, what are our lowest level inferences and, like 13 children raised their hand during the class. The teacher called on, I mean, there are certain things you can absolutely agree upon, especially if you videotape the thing. But then when you get into were the children, for the most part, interested in the lesson, were they, uh, was the teacher teaching in a way that most students could understand and follow what she was teaching, the agreement immediately breaks down. And then you go back to the lower inference data to say, well, what can we learn by watching this video again to see whose interpretation has the most support from the objective evidence? And I don't think it's one school or the other. It's always the sort of moving back and forth between those things.
I like that terminology, low and higher inference, and I think that's applicable to all kinds of stuff that we do. The philosophy has tended towards Plato, and after the 19th century, in the 20th century, it's tended towards what you're calling low inference, that we just try to say what we can know. But to be fair to Socrates, that's what he was saying too, that, wait a second, what did you mean by that? I'm not sure that makes any sense. And they have just in the 20th century, the guys, the Vienna Circle and trended towards the low inference stuff. That's very interesting. I like that phraseology.
I wonder if we could just touch for a minute on the current fad for abundance. Has anybody noticed that some of the public intellectuals are really into the idea of abundance right now? I mean, Ezra Klein comes to mind, and there are others. Um, I I wonder how it's hard for me to follow that when I know how much of the world is starving and how much of the world is living on $1 a day and how much contention there is all over the world between peoples of different habits and different religions and whatnot. Does anybody know anything about abundance?
Well, I can just say that I I just about every time Teresa and I live, I would say by American standards, modest lives. But we can eat anything we want, anytime we want, any time of day. It's always available to us. And that always astounds me that we have that level of luxury. And what you're talking about, to me, I'm surrounded with more abundance than I could, most of humanity could ever have conceived of until maybe the last 50 years, as a matter of fact. It's very recent. So I don't know what the conversation that you've seen publicly is about this, but we've got enough of it, is my idea.
Uh,
Peter,
I agree with the about how much abundance there is now, but a lot of ecologically minded writers, Wendell Berry especially comes to mind, will point out that we're getting this abundance while the population is increasing enormously, and while we are using up aquifers, arable land, fresh water of all sorts, that it can't possibly continue this way. So we'd better cut back on the abundance some if we want there to be, anything for future generations.
And
Peter,
meanwhile, the other species in the world are going extinct at a
Right,
rapid rate.
absolutely.
you guys are directing this conversation far too close to actual reality for my taste. Uh, let's not do that. Um, let's call it a day. It's been a very good one as usual. Don't think for a second. I go back and look at these sometimes, and I go, oh, there was so much more that could have been said there. But uh, just in the interest of moving forward, let's not consider reality. That would be the most horrible idea.